The courtroom is packed, cameras flash, reporters whisper, and every movement is watched. A man who once controlled docks, unions, politicians, and crime families now sits behind a wooden table, flanked by lawyers and guards. Years of secret meetings, coded messages, and hidden payments are about to be placed into public record. Witnesses wait in side rooms, documents stack on desks, and prosecutors organize timelines. Outside, headlines spread across the country. Inside, silence fills the air between questions and answers. This is where deals, betrayals, and networks are tested under oath. Every word matters, every detail is examined, and every connection is traced back to one name. The air in the courtroom is thick with tension, as the nation watches with bated breath. The trial of one man, a man who built an empire of crime so vast, so powerful, that it seemed impervious to the law, is finally about to reveal the dark secrets that have long remained hidden in the shadows of American society. Lucky Luciano, once the undisputed king of the American Mafia, now finds himself in the defendant's seat, facing a relentless prosecution determined to bring him down and expose the inner workings of his criminal empire. As the courtroom doors close behind him, the questions arise. Who is this man, and how did he come to control an empire built on betrayal, fear, and loyalty? What lies beneath the image of the suave, charismatic mob boss, and what kind of justice will be served in a battle that transcends the legal world and delves deep into the heart of American crime? This trial is more than just a legal matter. It is the final act in a saga that has unfolded over the course of decades, a saga rooted in power, survival, and ambition. The man at the center of it all, Charles Lucky Luciano, is no mere criminal. He is the mastermind behind the most organized, far-reaching crime syndicate in history. He has built an empire that stretches from the gritty streets of New York to the political corridors of power, and now, with his back against the wall, he faces the full force of the state. But for Luciano, this trial is not just about his freedom, it's about something much bigger. It is about the survival of the very system he created, the web of loyalty and fear that holds the Mafia together, and the extent to which his power can withstand the light of day. The courtroom is a battlefield, and Luciano is no stranger to battles. From the moment he entered the world of organized crime, he displayed a level of cunning and ruthlessness that would shape his rise to power. The very fact that he sits in this courtroom today rather than 6 feet under or behind bars, is a testament to his ability to outsmart rivals, bribe officials, and manipulate the system. But even a man like Luciano, who has orchestrated the downfall of so many others, cannot escape the inevitable confrontation with his past. In the end, it will not be his business acumen or his mastery of the Mafia code that will save him. It will be his ability to control the narrative, to turn the trial itself into another game of power and strategy. As the prosecutor steps forward, the eyes of the room lock onto Luciano. The man who once ruled New York's criminal underworld with an iron fist is now just another defendant, subject to the same scrutiny and pressure as any other. Yet even in the face of impending conviction, there is an air of confidence about him. His eyes, cold and calculating, betray no sign of fear. For Luciano, this trial is yet another challenge to conquer, another obstacle to navigate in a life that has been defined by overcoming the odds. But beneath the surface, there is a flicker of something else, a sense of inevitability. Perhaps, for the first time, Luciano understands that the game he has been playing for so long is coming to an end. The prosecution's case is damning. It paints Luciano as the central figure in a sprawling criminal enterprise that has taken root in every corner of American society. From bootlegging to labor unions, from gambling to prostitution, Luciano's fingerprints are everywhere. But the state's case is more than just a list of criminal activities. It is a full-scale assault on Luciano's empire, a direct attack on the very system of power that he has spent his life constructing. The witnesses called to testify are a who's who of underworld figures. Men who once served under Luciano, now turning on him in exchange for reduced sentences or immunity. These men, whose loyalty to Luciano once ran so deep that they would have taken a bullet for him, now line up to betray him in the most public way imaginable. As the testimony unfolds, Luciano's world begins to unravel. The facade of invincibility he has so carefully cultivated is shattered, piece by piece. The media, ever hungry for a scandal, seizes on every detail, turning each new revelation into a headline. The press paints Luciano as a ruthless, calculating criminal mastermind. Yet, for those who know him best, there is a deeper story, one that speaks not only to his genius but to his ability to manipulate loyalty and fear. As the trial progresses, the tension mounts. Luciano's defense team fights back with equal fervor, employing every legal tactic at their disposal. But even they know that the cards are stacked against them. This trial is more than just a legal proceeding. It is a moral reckoning for Luciano. The world he has built, a world where power is the ultimate currency and betrayal is a constant companion, is on the verge of collapsing. But Luciano's ability to adapt, to pivot in the face of adversity, may be his greatest strength. As the trial reaches its climax, the question looms: can he survive this final confrontation? And if so, at what cost? In the midst of the courtroom drama, one thing becomes clear. Luciano is no ordinary criminal. He is a man whose life has been defined by a singular pursuit of power. From his early days as a street-level thug to his rise as the most influential mobster in America, Luciano has always been one step ahead of everyone around him. He understands the game better than anyone, and even in the face of overwhelming evidence, he knows that the true measure of his power will not be determined by the court's verdict, but by his ability to control the narrative that follows. But for all his cunning, Luciano is not invincible. He may have built an empire, but in doing so, he has also created enemies who will stop at nothing to see him fall. As the trial unfolds, those enemies circle closer, ready to pounce on any weakness. And yet, despite the mounting pressure, Luciano remains calm, cool, collected. The man who once commanded loyalty from thousands of followers now stands alone, stripped of his empire, facing the very forces he spent his life trying to evade. In the end, this trial will not only determine the fate of one man, it will expose the dark underbelly of the American Mafia and the lengths to which men like Luciano will go to maintain control. It will shine a light on a world of crime, corruption, and betrayal that has long existed in the shadows, a world where loyalty is a commodity, and fear is the ultimate weapon. For Luciano, this trial is the culmination of a life built on deception and manipulation. It is the moment when everything he has fought for comes into sharp focus, when his empire is exposed for what it truly is, a house of cards built on lies and power. As the judge prepares to deliver the verdict, Luciano's mind races. What will the outcome be? Will he walk free, or will this be the moment when everything he has worked for comes crashing down? Regardless of the verdict, one thing is certain. This trial will mark the end of an era. The world that Luciano built will never be the same again, and neither will the underworld he once ruled. The question now is not whether he will survive the trial, but what kind of man he will be once the dust has settled. Will he be a martyr, a legend, or simply another casualty of a game that demands ultimate sacrifice? As the courtroom awaits the final judgment, the story of Lucky Luciano reaches its apex. The man who rose from nothing to become the king of the American Mafia now faces his reckoning. In the end, his trial will not just be about guilt or innocence. It will be about the nature of power, loyalty, and the price of ambition. It will be the moment when the true cost of living a life defined by crime and betrayal is finally revealed. And for Luciano, it will be the beginning of a new chapter, one that will forever alter the course of his life and the history of organized crime in America. Long before Lucky Luciano's name became synonymous with the American Mafia, the world of organized crime was a chaotic and fragmented web of competing factions, each with its own rules, codes, and rivalries. The criminal landscape in the early 20th century was a far cry from the empire that Luciano would later build. It was a volatile and dangerous place, with street-level thugs, corrupt politicians, and petty criminals constantly vying for control. In the heart of this maelstrom, Luciano would rise, not simply by strength or violence, but through a vision that would fundamentally transform the way the Mafia operated. But before that transformation could take place, the Mafia was far from unified. It was an era where power was decentralized, where crime bosses operated more like warlords than businessmen, and where personal vendettas were often as dangerous as the law itself. At the time, the Mafia was fragmented into various factions, most of which operated independently, each with its own interests, goals, and territorial boundaries. There was no overarching figure to unite the different factions into a cohesive, nationwide crime syndicate. The Sicilian Mafia, for instance, had its own network of influence, primarily in New York City, but also in other urban centers across the country. Then there were the Italian-American groups, the Jewish mobs, and other ethnic-based crime organizations. Each group had its own set of rules, its own way of doing business, and its own turf to protect. While there were alliances formed out of necessity, especially during Prohibition, these were often short-lived and fragile. Rivalries ran deep and betrayal was common. In this fractured world, there was no sense of the long-term stability that Luciano would later bring. The streets of New York were a battleground for control of the city's vast and lucrative criminal enterprises. It was a time when organized crime was still in its adolescence, not yet the global force it would become. The bootlegging business, for example, was rife with competition. With the rise of prohibition in 1920, a golden opportunity for criminals had emerged. Alcohol, once freely available, was suddenly banned, creating a massive black market. However, the profits that could be made were not without danger. The competition between rival gangs was fierce, and the stakes were high. Gang wars over territory, control of distribution routes, and access to supply chains became a common occurrence. For every businessman like Luciano, there were dozens of small-time operators scrambling for a piece of the action. But the problem was not just external. The Mafia itself was struggling with its internal organization. While many crime families had established themselves in key cities like New York, Chicago, and Boston, they operated more like independent entities than a unified force. The individual bosses, like Joe Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano, were powerful figures in their own right, but each one was essentially a warlord of his own domain. They often came into conflict with one another over control of territories, resources, and, most importantly, influence. The bloodshed was constant, with each new skirmish only further fracturing the fragile alliances that had been built. It was a world of constant violence, where betrayal was the only certainty. It was against this backdrop of chaos and instability that Lucky Luciano would begin to shape his vision for the future of organized crime. Born in the slums of New York, Luciano had grown up in the very heart of the criminal world. He knew the streets and the people who ruled them. But he also saw the cracks in the Mafia's system. He understood that in order for the Mafia to survive and thrive, it would need to evolve. The old ways of doing business, run by individual bosses constantly at war with one another, were not sustainable. If the Mafia were to become a lasting power, it would need to be unified, organized, and methodical. Luciano knew that the chaos that defined the underworld was a weakness, not a strength. While Luciano was rising through the ranks, he took note of the changing environment. Prohibition had brought immense wealth to those who could control the alcohol trade, but it had also created opportunities for new kinds of criminal operations. Luciano saw this as an opportunity to reshape the entire structure of organized crime. He understood that the key to power was not just in brute force, but in organization, loyalty, and control. Luciano wasn't just interested in making money, he was interested in building an empire. He wanted a world where the chaos of the past could be replaced with a more efficient system. One where everyone had a role to play, where power was centralized, and where resources could be maximized. This vision would eventually lead to the creation of the National Crime Syndicate, a collection of mafia families that would bring unprecedented unity and order to the underworld. But before Luciano could put his vision into practice, the old guard had to be dealt with. The existing bosses, like Masuria and Maranzano, represented the old way of doing things. Their leadership was based on personal loyalty, brute force, and an adherence to the traditions of the past. These were men who ruled through intimidation and fear, men who believed that power was maintained through violence. But for Luciano, violence was a tool, not the ultimate solution. His approach was more sophisticated. He sought to leverage the resources of the Mafia to create something bigger than any individual boss. In order to do that, the power structure had to be changed. And the only way to do that was to challenge the very men who were the embodiment of the old ways. Luciano's rise to power was not without conflict. The Castellamarese War, a brutal battle between the forces of Masuria and Maranzano, was one of the defining moments of his early career. The war was not just a fight for territory, it was a fight for the future of the Mafia itself. Luciano recognized that the violence would not stop until one of the factions was eliminated, and so he took a calculated risk. Rather than supporting either side, he bided his time, quietly consolidating his own power. He knew that the key to his success lay in patience and strategic alliances. When the time came, he moved decisively, and the result was the destruction of both Masuria and Maranzano, leaving Luciano as the undisputed leader of the Mafia. The implications of his victory were enormous. With Masuria and Maranzano out of the picture, Luciano was able to establish a new order. One where power was no longer concentrated in the hands of individual bosses, but was spread across a network of families. He formalized the structure that would come to define the modern Mafia, a system where the heads of each family were answerable to a central authority, and where resources could be shared to maximize profits. The old Mafia, with its disunity and constant bloodshed, was gone. In its place was a new, more efficient criminal organization, a criminal empire built on loyalty, structure, and calculated power. But even as Luciano's empire grew, he knew that his vision would not be accepted by everyone. The old-school Mafia bosses who had survived the war were still powerful, and many of them resented the changes that Luciano was bringing. But Luciano's rise was unstoppable. He had demonstrated a level of ruthlessness and strategic genius that earned him the respect of both allies and enemies. The old Mafia was dead. Long live the new Mafia. In many ways, this moment marked the beginning of the golden age of organized crime. With Luciano at the helm, the Mafia would no longer be a fragmented network of gangs and petty criminals. It would become a force to be reckoned with, a business empire that would rival the legal economy. The idea of the Mafia as an organized, corporate-like structure had finally come to fruition. Luciano had done what no other crime boss before him had managed to do. He had turned the chaos of the underworld into a functioning empire, one that was as efficient as it was brutal. The old world had been swept away, and a new, more dangerous era had begun. And so, as Luciano took his place at the top of the criminal world, he could look back at the fragmented, chaotic underworld of his youth and recognize that the man who had once been just another street-level thug had now transformed that very underworld into a finely tuned machine. The battle for control of the Mafia was over. The future belonged to Lucky Luciano. In the heart of New York's Lower East Side, in the early 1900s, Charles Lucky Luciano was born into a world that seemed determined to trap him in its web of poverty, hardship, and crime. His parents, poor Sicilian immigrants, were part of a larger wave of new arrivals to America, an influx of individuals seeking a better life but often finding only struggle and exploitation. The bustling streets of the city, filled with the constant hum of activity and the clatter of street vendors, provided a grim backdrop for Luciano's early years. There was little room for dreams in a neighborhood where survival was the primary concern, and the odds of escaping the cycle of poverty seemed slim. Luciano's childhood was steeped in the harsh realities of immigrant life. The tenements where his family lived were cramped and squalid, offering little comfort or hope for a better future. His early education was, at best, minimal. His parents, struggling to make ends meet, had little time for schooling beyond the basics. Instead, Luciano learned his lessons on the streets. He learned to navigate the complex world of New York's immigrant communities, where alliances and loyalties were formed not through blood, but through necessity. The streets taught him the importance of survival, of knowing who to trust and who to fear. From a young age, Luciano was keenly aware of the power dynamics at play. In the tenement buildings, on the street corners, and in the alleyways, there was an invisible code, a set of rules that governed who controlled what. It wasn't just about who had money, it was about who had influence, who could command respect, and who could protect their interests. This code would become the foundation of Luciano's understanding of power. It was a world of hierarchies, where the strong preyed upon the weak, and the only way to succeed was to rise above the rest. Luciano knew that he had to be ruthless to get ahead, but he also knew that brute force alone wouldn't guarantee his success. He needed something more: intelligence, cunning, and the ability to make the right alliances. By the time Luciano was a teenager, he had already begun to test his own limits. He was involved in petty crime, running small scams, and participating in street-level operations, learning the ropes of the criminal underworld firsthand. But even as a young man, he showed signs of something more than just a desire for quick money or street cred. He had a vision, a sense that there was more to the world of organized crime than simply selling stolen goods or running numbers. He understood that in order to rise to the top, he would need to move beyond the chaos and create something more structured, something that could last. In many ways, this vision would become the driving force of his life. Luciano's early years also revealed a certain pragmatism, a quality that would serve him well as he climbed the ladder of the Mafia. He wasn't sentimental or bound by tradition. He was driven by one goal: power. He was willing to use any means necessary to achieve that goal, but he also understood the value of patience. He knew that to truly control New York's criminal underworld, he would have to play a long game, carefully building his influence, making strategic alliances, and waiting for the right moment to strike. Unlike many of the mobsters of his time, Luciano wasn't a flash-in-the-pan figure. He was a planner, a thinker, and a man who understood that success in the criminal world came not just from acting swiftly, but from acting wisely. The streets of New York were a proving ground for Luciano. The city was alive with opportunity for those willing to take risks, but it was also a dangerous and unforgiving place. The competition for power and territory was fierce, and anyone who wasn't careful could end up in the morgue or behind bars. But Luciano's ambition was matched by his intelligence. He quickly realized that there was more to organized crime than simple extortion and racketeering. He saw that the real money, and the real power, lay in the more complex and profitable ventures that were starting to emerge. One of these opportunities was bootlegging, a business that would come to define the criminal world during Prohibition. With alcohol banned across the United States, it created a massive underground market that needed to be controlled. Luciano's first taste of true power came with his involvement in the bootlegging trade. In the early 1920s, as prohibition took hold, alcohol was in high demand, but it was illegal to produce, distribute, or sell it. This created an ideal situation for those in the criminal world who were able to navigate the legal and logistical hurdles of smuggling alcohol into the country. Luciano quickly became a key player in this trade, leveraging his street smarts and connections to establish a foothold in the burgeoning business. He understood that bootlegging was more than just a way to make money, it was an opportunity to build a network, to strengthen his position, and to lay the foundation for future control of the underworld. The money Luciano made from bootlegging was immense, but it was not just the profits that mattered to him. It was the power that came with it. As he expanded his operations, he began to form alliances with other criminals, Jews, Italians, and others, who shared his ambition. Luciano was a shrewd operator, and he knew that in order to build a lasting empire, he would need to bring together the various factions of the criminal world. This was not something that had been done before. In the past, each group operated independently with their own leadership and their own goals. But Luciano saw the potential for something much bigger. If he could unite the different ethnic groups, pooling their resources and manpower, he could create a more powerful and efficient operation. Luciano's ability to build these alliances was part of what set him apart from other mobsters of his time. Where others relied on brute force or fear, Luciano relied on diplomacy and negotiation. He understood the value of collaboration, even with those who might otherwise be considered rivals. In this sense, he was ahead of his time. His ability to see the big picture, to understand that the future of organized crime lay in unity rather than division, made him a visionary. He was not just a mobster, he was a businessman, a strategist, and a leader who understood the dynamics of power and influence in a way that few others did. Through his alliances and his growing control over the bootlegging business, Luciano began to build his empire. But his success was not without challenges. The Mafia world was still deeply divided, and Luciano had to contend with powerful figures like Joe Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano, who represented the old guard of the Mafia. These men ruled through fear and violence, and they were determined to maintain their dominance. For Luciano, however, they were obstacles to his vision of a more organized and profitable criminal enterprise. In the coming years, he would come to realize that in order to truly dominate the Mafia, he would need to eliminate these old-school bosses and pave the way for a new, more centralized power structure. But before that could happen, he had to solidify his position and secure his alliances. As Luciano moved through the early stages of his career, the lessons he learned on the streets began to pay off. He was no longer just a young street hustler trying to make a name for himself. He was becoming a master of the game, a man who understood not just how to survive but how to thrive. By his late 20s, Luciano was already one of the most influential figures in the New York criminal underworld. His rise was not accidental, nor was it based solely on violence or intimidation. It was the result of a deliberate strategy, a long-term plan to create an empire that would eventually stretch across the nation. Luciano's early life was defined by hardship, but it also laid the groundwork for his future success. The streets of New York taught him lessons that no school or mentor could provide. Lessons about loyalty, power, and the importance of seeing beyond the immediate circumstances. It was in these formative years that Luciano began to understand the complex world of organized crime, and it was here that he learned the art of survival. Through intelligence, patience, and a willingness to adapt, he transformed himself from a poor immigrant child into the mastermind behind one of the most powerful criminal organizations in history. It was a journey that would eventually lead him to the top, but not without immense challenges, rivalries, and betrayals along the way. By the time Lucky Luciano had consolidated his power in New York's criminal world, he had come to realize that the Mafia's traditional structure, built on chaotic factions and constant turf wars, was unsustainable. It wasn't enough to rule by fear or brute force alone. If Luciano was to truly control not just New York but the entire nation's underworld, he would need to reshape the Mafia into something more organized, something that functioned with the precision and efficiency of a corporation. He saw that the Mafia was, in essence, a business, a highly profitable one at that, but it lacked the structure and management necessary for long-term success. In Luciano's mind, crime was no different from any other industry. It needed leaders, rules, systems, and most importantly, a clear hierarchy. Luciano understood that the future of the Mafia required a shift in perspective. The old ways, where each crime family operated independently, often at odds with one another, were bound to lead to self-destruction. The constant feuding and backstabbing had weakened the Mafia. Luciano had seen firsthand how deadly these rivalries could be, especially when they escalated into all-out wars, like the infamous Castellamarese War, where mobsters killed one another in a bid to control New York's underworld. Luciano's vision for the Mafia was not just about power, it was about survival. And survival, he knew, could only come through unity, organization, and efficiency. He was determined to create a system that would endure, not just for a few years but for generations to come. His first major step toward this vision was his ability to form alliances. Luciano wasn't just focused on building his own power. He understood that the Mafia would be stronger if the various families worked together, pooling their resources instead of fighting one another. He sought out key figures from other factions, including Meyer Lansky, a Jewish gangster with whom he would form a lifelong partnership, and Frank Costello, a powerful figure within the Genovese family. By aligning himself with these figures, Luciano created a coalition that could weather any storm. This was the beginning of the National Crime Syndicate, a loose network of mafia families across the country that would operate as one entity, albeit with separate branches. Luciano's genius lay in his ability to recognize the strengths of each family and use them to his advantage. While the Sicilian Mafia was the most powerful group, Luciano knew that the Jewish and Italian-American factions also played crucial roles in controlling various aspects of the criminal enterprise. Lansky, for example, had an unparalleled understanding of the casino business and international smuggling networks. Costello, on the other hand, was a master of political connections and had a network of allies that stretched all the way into the highest levels of government. Luciano recognized the importance of these alliances, and he made sure that each player knew their value to the collective enterprise. The Mafia was no longer a collection of independent, feuding families. It was a unified, highly structured organization. Luciano's second major innovation was the creation of the Commission, a governing body that would oversee the actions of all the Mafia families. The Commission was the brainchild of Luciano, and it would become the cornerstone of the Mafia's success during the early and mid-20th century. Essentially, the Commission acted as a governing council that would arbitrate disputes, approve major decisions, and ensure that power remained balanced among the families. Each family had a representative on the Commission, which included the heads of the 5 New York crime families and several other influential figures from across the country. The Commission's creation was a revolutionary step for the Mafia. It centralized power in a way that no one family could dominate the others, and it provided a way to resolve conflicts without resorting to all-out violence. Luciano's strategic brilliance was not limited to his ability to organize the Mafia's inner workings. He also understood that the Mafia's business had to evolve if it was going to survive in the modern world. The old, traditional criminal enterprises, bootlegging, gambling, and extortion, were still lucrative, but they were becoming increasingly risky. As the government cracked down on prohibition and other illegal activities, Luciano realized that in order to protect his empire, he needed to diversify. One of the key ways he did this was by expanding into labor unions, which would become a major source of income and power for the Mafia in the years to come. Luciano knew that labor unions were fertile ground for corruption. The labor movement, which was gaining traction during the early 20th century, was ripe for exploitation. Luciano, with his connections and influence, was able to infiltrate key unions and use them as a means to control everything from construction projects to transportation and shipping. By controlling the unions, Luciano could extort businesses, demand kickbacks, and even influence elections. This was not just a source of income, it was a means of ensuring that the Mafia had influence over some of the most important industries in America. At the same time, Luciano also sought to expand the Mafia's reach beyond New York City. While New York was the heart of his empire, Luciano understood that in order to solidify his position, he needed to control key cities across the country. He reached out to mobsters in Chicago, New Orleans, and other major urban centers, offering them a piece of the pie in exchange for loyalty. Luciano's ability to bring different factions together under one umbrella made him the undisputed leader of the Mafia, not just in New York but across the nation. Under his leadership, the Mafia became a national organization with fingers in every major industry, from gambling to drugs to labor unions. He had transformed the Mafia from a loose collection of street-level criminals into a highly organized, efficient criminal empire that operated like a business. But while Luciano was consolidating his power and expanding his empire, he was also constantly thinking ahead. He knew that in order to maintain his control, he had to be adaptable. The world was changing rapidly, and Luciano understood that he couldn't rely solely on old methods to maintain power. The government was becoming more aggressive in its pursuit of organized crime, and the political landscape was shifting. In response, Luciano began to adjust his approach. He became more subtle, more strategic, and more focused on building long-term relationships with key political figures. Luciano's ability to maintain his power through political connections, as well as his skill in navigating the complex legal and social landscape, set him apart from other mobsters of his time. While many gangsters relied solely on violence and intimidation, Luciano knew that true power lay in influence and control. This vision, this drive to build a more organized and efficient mafia, would ultimately define Luciano's legacy. He transformed the mafia from a disorganized, chaotic force into a powerful, well-oiled machine that could rival even legitimate businesses. But his success wasn't without challenges. As his empire grew, so did the number of people who wanted a piece of it, and Luciano's role as a central figure made him a target for both rivals and law enforcement. His consolidation of power, while brilliant, also painted a large target on his back. Still, Luciano's ability to see the big picture, to build alliances and structures that would outlast the chaos of street-level crime, marked him as one of the most innovative and influential figures in the history of organized crime. He didn't just want to be a mob boss, he wanted to be a kingpin, a man whose influence reached far beyond the criminal underworld. And through his vision, his alliances, and his relentless drive for control, Luciano achieved that goal, forever changing the course of the Mafia and its role in American society. The Mafia, with its intricate web of allegiances and betrayals, was a world governed by an unspoken but rigid code of conduct, one that demanded loyalty above all else. This code, known as omerta, was central to the functioning of organized crime. It wasn't just a set of rules, it was a way of life, a moral compass that dictated how members of the Mafia interacted with one another and the world around them. In the criminal underworld, loyalty was not just a virtue, it was a matter of survival. To break the code was to invite death. Betrayal was not just a crime, it was a death sentence. Lucky Luciano, despite his ruthless nature and strategic brilliance, understood the importance of loyalty within his criminal empire. He realized that, while power could be seized through violence and cunning, true power in the Mafia came from the loyalty of the men who served under him. Without loyalty, the system would crumble. Without trust, the very foundation of the Mafia would disintegrate into chaos. Luciano was acutely aware of this reality, and it was part of the reason he worked so hard to build and maintain strong alliances with those around him. But even as he cultivated loyalty, Luciano knew that the code of omerta had a darker side, one that could be just as destructive as the violence it sought to prevent. Omerta, in its purest form, demanded complete silence in the face of the law. To cooperate with authorities was seen as the ultimate betrayal. But loyalty, in the Mafia, extended beyond simply keeping quiet in the face of law enforcement. It was also about the loyalty between members of the Mafia itself. If a man betrayed his boss, his family, or even a fellow soldier, the repercussions were severe. Trust was the currency in this world, and breaking it meant paying the ultimate price. A betrayal wasn't just a violation of the code, it was an affront to the very structure of power that kept the Mafia intact. Luciano, while ruthless in his pursuit of power, was also an astute observer of human nature. He knew that to maintain loyalty within his ranks, he had to reward those who followed the code while punishing those who did not. His leadership was marked by a complex balance between trust and fear. He cultivated an air of respect, often using his alliances to bind people to him, but he also made it clear that crossing him was a line that could not be erased. His power was built on this balance, and it was what allowed him to bring stability to the fractured underworld that had existed before his rise. In this sense, Luciano's leadership style was as much about psychology as it was about brute strength. He understood that men who felt secure in their loyalty would fight harder and more effectively for him, and that fear, though effective in the short term, could only take him so far. The idea of loyalty to one's family, however, was not always as clear-cut as it seemed. The Mafia was full of ambitious men, each with their own dreams and desires, and often these ambitions collided. While loyalty to the boss and the family was paramount, there were moments when personal ambition could lead to betrayal. Luciano himself understood this dynamic, and it was part of what made him such a dangerous and effective leader. He knew that ambition could be harnessed, channeled in ways that served the larger goals of the Mafia, but he also knew that unchecked ambition could lead to infighting and eventual destruction. His ability to read people, to understand their motivations and desires, allowed him to keep this delicate balance in check. But Luciano was not naive. He knew that loyalty was not always absolute. There would always be those who sought to undermine him, who believed they could replace him, or who felt entitled to power within the organization. For some, loyalty was a bargaining chip, something to be given in exchange for personal gain. For others, loyalty was a way to move up the ranks, a tool to secure a better position within the organization. And for those who had nothing to lose, loyalty could be discarded at a moment's notice, replaced by the promise of power or revenge. In a world where the stakes were life and death, loyalty was not just a moral choice, it was a calculated decision based on survival. Luciano understood the complexities of loyalty better than anyone. He had been a part of the system long enough to know that the Mafia was full of contradictions. Men who swore undying loyalty to their boss would betray them in a heartbeat if the right opportunity arose. The men who were most loyal to Luciano were not always the ones he trusted the most, they were often the ones who had the most to gain from his continued success. Loyalty in the Mafia was a fluid concept. It was constantly in flux, shifting with the tides of power and opportunity. But despite this, Luciano managed to maintain a firm grip on his empire by ensuring that the men who served under him knew the consequences of betrayal and the rewards of loyalty. As Luciano's power grew, so too did the pressure on him to maintain control. He had created an empire built on loyalty, but even the most steadfast men could be swayed. In the violent world of organized crime, where alliances were forged in blood and broken just as quickly, loyalty was always in jeopardy. Luciano had seen firsthand how men who had once been his closest allies could turn on him, and he had dealt with betrayal in the most brutal way. Those who betrayed him or broke the code of Omerta were not just killed, they were made examples of. To maintain loyalty, Luciano understood that fear had to be part of the equation. Yet even as fear was used as a tool to ensure obedience, Luciano also knew that he had to balance it with respect. In many ways, his leadership was a masterclass in psychological manipulation. He knew that loyalty could not be maintained purely through fear. If men felt they had no future in the Mafia, if they felt they were constantly at risk of betrayal, they would eventually turn on their boss. Luciano made sure to surround himself with men who were both loyal and capable, and he understood the importance of rewarding loyalty when it was earned. The Code of Omerta, while a tool for maintaining order, also had its own set of dangers. The more deeply it was ingrained into the Mafia's psyche, the more it reinforced the idea that betrayal was unforgivable. This created a cycle of fear and violence that often made it difficult for members of the Mafia to escape the grip of their bosses, even if they wanted to. Once you entered the world of organized crime, there was little room for redemption. A person's loyalty to the family often meant that their fate was sealed, whether they wanted it to be or not. And for those like Luciano who had worked their entire lives to rise to the top, there was little room for mercy, especially when a breach of loyalty threatened the entire structure of the empire they had worked so hard to build. In Luciano's world, loyalty was both the glue that held the Mafia together and the force that could tear it apart. His ability to navigate this complex web of trust and fear allowed him to build an empire that stood for years. He understood that loyalty was not just about following orders, it was about ensuring that everyone had a stake in the system, that every person knew their role and understood what would happen if they violated the code. Luciano's leadership was built on this understanding of loyalty and betrayal, and it was what made him one of the most powerful and feared figures in the history of organized crime. Luciano's rise to power was not solely driven by his understanding of loyalty or his strategic alliances, it was also deeply rooted in his ability to turn the business of crime into something far more structured and profitable. He was not just a gangster, he was a visionary businessman with a keen understanding of the value of organized, systematic control. While many of his contemporaries were content with the old ways of doing business, extorting protection money, running small-scale gambling operations, or smuggling alcohol, Luciano saw the potential for something much bigger. He saw crime not as a series of isolated ventures, but as a complex, interlocking system that, if run correctly, could rival any legitimate corporation. The key, he understood, was to treat crime like a business, efficient, organized, and profitable. Before Luciano's time, the Mafia was a chaotic mix of small-time racketeers and corrupt politicians, often fighting amongst themselves for control of various territories or criminal enterprises. There was no coordination, no long-term planning, and no central leadership. This disorganized structure often led to infighting, wasted resources, and missed opportunities. Luciano saw this as a fundamental weakness, and he was determined to create a more sophisticated system. His genius lay in his ability to apply business principles to the Mafia. He recognized that the key to success in organized crime, like in any legitimate business, was efficiency. Profits had to be maximized, overhead minimized, and competition eliminated. To achieve this, Luciano began by centralizing operations. One of the first things he did was to streamline the Mafia's many criminal enterprises, turning them into highly organized and hierarchical businesses. Instead of every boss running his own independent operation, Luciano sought to consolidate power, bringing different factions together under one unified structure. This allowed him to eliminate inefficiencies, reduce infighting, and better control the flow of money. His system was built on the idea that every family, every member, had a specific role to play in the larger organization. This approach created an almost corporate-like atmosphere within the Mafia, where each part of the operation functioned like a department within a business, contributing to the overall success of the enterprise. Luciano's first major move in this direction was his involvement in the bootlegging trade during Prohibition. When alcohol was banned in the United States, a massive underground market was created, one that was ripe for exploitation. Luciano didn't just jump into this market the way many others did, relying solely on violence and intimidation. Instead, he approached bootlegging as a business venture. He established a reliable supply chain, built efficient distribution networks, and ensured that every step of the operation was tightly controlled. He didn't just want to be the guy selling alcohol on the street corner, he wanted to control the entire process from production to distribution. He understood that success in the business of crime required more than just muscle. It required planning, organization, and careful management. Luciano's influence spread quickly as he took control of more and more aspects of the bootlegging business. He began to organize distribution networks, ensuring that alcohol was moved efficiently throughout the city and even beyond. He made sure that his operations were protected, eliminating competitors and securing alliances with other powerful figures in the criminal world. Luciano's ability to see the bigger picture was one of the things that set him apart from other gangsters. While many were focused on immediate gains, Luciano was building an empire that would last. He wasn't just thinking about the next shipment of booze, he was thinking about the future of organized crime, and how to expand it into new territories and new industries. As his bootlegging operations grew, Luciano turned his attention to other areas of organized crime, expanding his empire to include gambling, extortion, and labor racketeering. These industries, which had long been part of the Mafia's operations, were in need of modernization. Luciano understood that in order to remain profitable and sustainable, these businesses had to be organized and streamlined. He set up gambling rings, established illegal casinos, and created systems to ensure that money was flowing steadily through the operation. He also realized that the power of the Mafia was not just in its criminal activities, but in its ability to influence entire industries. By infiltrating labor unions, Luciano and his allies were able to extort money from legitimate businesses, using the threat of strikes or work stoppages to demand kickbacks. These labor rackets became a major source of income for Luciano and his organization, and they played a key role in the Mafia's expansion during this period. Luciano's most notable business venture, however, was his ability to bring the Mafia's various criminal activities into a cohesive and profitable network. He didn't just run gambling or bootlegging operations in isolation, he integrated them. For example, Luciano's men would often run numbers rackets, a form of illegal gambling, alongside bootlegging and labor racketeering. The profits from one enterprise would fuel the next, creating a cycle of wealth that allowed Luciano's empire to thrive. He also saw the potential for global expansion, and he was one of the first Mafia bosses to recognize the importance of international operations. Luciano's influence reached beyond the borders of the United States, as he established ties with criminal organizations in Cuba, Canada, and even Europe. This international network allowed him to expand his empire even further, giving him access to new markets and new sources of revenue. While Luciano was making his fortune through the expansion of organized crime, he also understood the importance of politics. He realized that in order to ensure the continued success of his operations, he needed to have allies in positions of power. Politicians, law enforcement officials, and businessmen all played a role in maintaining the status quo, and Luciano made sure to cultivate relationships with these key figures. He wasn't just making deals with other gangsters, he was building a network of influential people who could help protect his interests. In this way, Luciano's criminal empire operated much like a legitimate business. He had the resources, the organization, and the connections necessary to thrive in a competitive and often hostile environment. The organization Luciano created was not just about crime, it was a business model that could endure. By the time Prohibition came to an end in 1933, Luciano's empire had grown immensely. He had expanded into a wide range of illegal activities from gambling to labor racketeering, and his influence stretched across the country and beyond. He had turned the Mafia into a highly organized, efficient, and profitable enterprise, one that could rival any legitimate corporation in terms of its scope and its impact on the economy. The key to his success was his ability to think long-term, to recognize opportunities before others did, and to treat crime as a business. Luciano's approach to organized crime laid the foundation for the modern mafia and established him as one of the most influential and innovative criminals in history. Luciano's organizational skills weren't just limited to his ability to expand the mafia's criminal enterprises, they also played a crucial role in the way he ran his day-to-day operations. He set up a complex system of rules, procedures, and hierarchies that ensured his empire operated smoothly. He understood the importance of delegation, knowing that he couldn't run every aspect of his empire personally. Instead, he surrounded himself with a loyal group of trusted allies, each of whom was responsible for overseeing a specific part of the operation. These lieutenants, like Frank Costello and Meyer Lansky, were essential to the functioning of the mafia, and they were instrumental in carrying out Luciano's vision. By giving his men specific responsibilities and empowering them to make decisions, Luciano ensured that his empire ran like a well-oiled machine. This system allowed him to focus on the larger strategic goals of the organization while still maintaining control over the day-to-day operations. In the world of organized crime, success wasn't just about making money, it was about control. Luciano understood that in order to maintain his power, he had to keep a tight grip on his empire. His success was built on a foundation of organization, efficiency, and loyalty. He created a criminal empire that was as sophisticated and well-run as any legitimate business, and it was this level of organization that allowed him to become the most powerful and influential mafia boss in history. Through his understanding of business and his ability to apply those principles to the world of crime, Luciano transformed the mafia from a chaotic collection of small-time operations into a global criminal powerhouse. His legacy, built on the principles of organization, efficiency, and control, continues to influence the world of organized crime to this day. As Luciano's criminal empire expanded and his grip on power tightened, the alliances he forged were critical to his success. His ability to navigate the often treacherous waters of mafia politics was one of the keys to his dominance. However, as Luciano grew more powerful, so did the rivalries that would eventually lead to internal conflict, betrayal, and the reshaping of the underworld. The very same alliances that helped him secure his throne would later fracture, creating dangerous fault lines in his empire. It was in these power struggles, where loyalty would be tested, that the true nature of Luciano's leadership would be put to the ultimate test. At the heart of the growing tensions were the personalities of the men who surrounded Luciano. The mafia, for all its structure and hierarchy, was a business of men with huge egos and ambitions. While Luciano understood that power was best maintained through a collective approach, not all of his allies were as keen to share the spoils. The men who helped him ascend to power, figures like Frank Costello, Meyer Lansky, and others, were indispensable to his success. But beneath the surface of these partnerships, deep currents of ambition ran strong. Costello, a master of manipulation and political connections, was known for his cool-headed decision-making. Lansky, on the other hand, had a sharp mind for finances and business but also had his own ideas about how the mafia should be run. The first cracks in the carefully constructed alliances appeared when Luciano began to assert his control over the entire mafia, sidelining some of the older guard. For years, the mafia had been run by rival factions, with each boss controlling a territory and operating largely independent of others. Luciano's vision of unification, though genius in the long term, began to ruffle feathers as he started consolidating power. Four men like Joe Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano, who represented the old Italian families, Luciano's ambitions were seen as a threat to their control. These men, steeped in traditional mafia ways, were unwilling to relinquish their power without a fight. The rise of Luciano marked the beginning of the end for the old-school bosses. Luciano was younger, more ambitious, and more capable of forging alliances that transcended ethnic lines. The traditional Italian mafia structure, built on blood ties and strict codes of conduct, was being replaced by a more pragmatic, business-like approach. This shift in thinking was seen as both revolutionary and dangerous. Masuria and Maranzano, men who had spent their lives building their own legacies, viewed Luciano's consolidation as a direct challenge to their authority. And in the world of the mafia, challenges to authority were often met with violence. The tension between the old and new guard culminated in the Castellamarese War, a bloody conflict that pitted Luciano against the more traditionalist factions of the mafia. The war, which lasted for several years, saw a series of brutal killings, power grabs, and betrayals. It was a chaotic, vicious time in the mafia's history, with Luciano using every tool at his disposal, alliances, strategy, and violence, to eliminate his rivals. But even as the bodies piled up, Luciano was calculating his next move. His primary goal wasn't simply to destroy his enemies, it was to emerge as the undisputed leader of the entire Mafia. And that meant taking control of not just New York but of the entire criminal network that stretched across the country. Luciano's rise during the war was not without complications. While he had managed to secure the loyalty of many key figures, there were others who were still uncertain about his leadership. Some of the older bosses who had been hesitant to back Luciano began to see the tide turning in his favor. But Luciano knew that the war was about more than just physical domination. It was a battle for influence and control over the hearts and minds of the Mafia's members. In this context, he used not only force but persuasion, convincing his allies that a unified Mafia under his leadership was the only way to ensure its survival and prosperity. One of the key turning points in the Castellamarese War came when Luciano formed an alliance with another key figure, Meyer Lansky. Lansky, a brilliant strategist and financier, was invaluable to Luciano's cause. Lansky's connections in the world of finance and his ability to launder money were crucial in solidifying Luciano's empire. But beyond that, Lansky brought a level of intelligence and foresight that Luciano lacked in some areas. Where Luciano was focused on consolidating power, Lansky was thinking about the long-term structure of their operations. This partnership allowed Luciano to grow his influence, expanding his criminal empire while simultaneously strengthening the financial underpinnings of the organization. However, even as the tide turned in Luciano's favor, there were still enemies to deal with. Joe Masuria, who had been one of Luciano's primary adversaries during the war, had become a major target. Masuria was a powerful figure, known for his ruthlessness and control over large swaths of New York's underworld. He had been a formidable opponent for Luciano, but his strength had begun to wane. Luciano knew that if he wanted to emerge as the true boss, he needed to eliminate Masuria once and for all. In one of the most infamous betrayals in Mafia history, Luciano arranged for Masuria's murder. The killing, orchestrated by Luciano's men, was a watershed moment. With Masuria's death, Luciano had solidified his position as the uncontested leader of the New York Mafia. But Luciano's path to power was not without moral compromises. He had grown accustomed to the cutthroat nature of the business, and his willingness to betray former allies and partners would shape his leadership. The death of Masuria, while a victory for Luciano, also signaled a shift in his character. He was no longer the young, ambitious gangster trying to prove himself. He had become a ruthless leader, one who was willing to do whatever it took to maintain his position of power. The war had taught him valuable lessons about loyalty, ambition, and survival, but it had also hardened him. As the years passed, Luciano's transformation from a street-smart hustler into a cold and calculating criminal mastermind was complete. In the aftermath of the Castellamarese War, Luciano's empire was firmly established. His victory had not only eliminated his rivals but had also brought stability to the fractured world of organized crime. By uniting the Mafia under one central leadership, Luciano was able to establish a power structure that would endure for decades. The Commission, a governing body that he had created to arbitrate disputes and maintain order among the Mafia families, became the cornerstone of his rule. The Commission provided a framework for cooperation and negotiation, ensuring that the various families worked together for the common good of the Mafia. But while this system helped maintain stability, it also laid the groundwork for future power struggles. As Luciano's influence grew, so did the number of people who wanted a piece of his empire. The Mafia was no longer a series of competing factions. It had become a multi-billion-dollar criminal enterprise that spanned the globe. And with that wealth came competition. Rival mobsters, ambitious outsiders, and even former allies all eyed Luciano's throne. The very success of his empire, which had once made him untouchable, now became the source of constant challenges to his authority. Luciano's ability to manage these challenges, both from within his own ranks and from external forces, would be critical in the coming years. He had established a model of organized crime that was unparalleled in its scale and sophistication, but maintaining that power was another matter entirely. The rise of new rivals, as well as increasing pressure from law enforcement, would force Luciano to constantly adjust his tactics. His leadership, though brilliant, would be tested time and time again as his empire expanded and the stakes grew higher. The hidden war that raged beneath the surface of Luciano's empire was not fought with guns alone. It was a war of control, of power, and of influence. While Luciano's rise to dominance had been marked by strategic alliances and calculated betrayals, it was in this period of consolidation and growth that the true battle for survival began. As Luciano's criminal organization expanded, so did the forces that sought to challenge it, both from within and outside the Mafia. The enemies weren't always in the form of rival gangsters or corrupt officials. Sometimes, the greatest threats came from the shifting balance of power, the changing landscape of law enforcement, and the growing ambitions of his own men. Luciano's empire, now firmly established and recognized as one of the most powerful criminal organizations in the world, required constant vigilance. To manage the growing scope of his operations, he had to rely on a system of collaboration and compromise, which allowed him to maintain influence over territories and criminal enterprises spanning from New York to the Caribbean, from Chicago to the West Coast. However, with this vast expansion came a multitude of risks. Rival factions, both within his ranks and from outside, sought to undermine him, and he knew that at any given moment his control could be fractured by betrayal, greed, or the reach of the law. The stakes were high and the game was more dangerous than ever. The most immediate threat came from the government, which was beginning to hone in on organized crime. Luciano's most lucrative enterprises, bootlegging, gambling, and labor racketeering, had placed him firmly in the crosshairs of federal agents. The end of Prohibition in 1933 had significantly reduced the Mafia's most profitable source of income, but Luciano was far from defeated. He had diversified his operations, but the pressure from law enforcement was only intensifying. The increasing scrutiny from the government meant that the Mafia needed to adapt in order to survive. Luciano was not one to shy away from challenges. He knew that in the world of organized crime, survival depended on innovation and the ability to stay one step ahead of the authorities. To this end, Luciano relied on his considerable network of contacts, both within the criminal world and in legitimate society. He maintained a delicate balance, carefully orchestrating his alliances with politicians, judges, and law enforcement officers. The concept of greasing the wheels was central to his strategy. By ensuring that law enforcement and public officials were on his payroll, Luciano was able to maintain a degree of protection for his organization. But this arrangement was not foolproof. The law was closing in, and there were always those within the government who were determined to bring down the Mafia. Luciano's efforts to keep the law at bay were further complicated by the presence of new rivals within the criminal underworld. As the Mafia grew in wealth and power, so did the ambitions of other organized crime syndicates. The Chicago outfit, led by Al Capone, had long been a formidable adversary, but Luciano's influence had begun to stretch beyond New York. While Capone had once been the undisputed king of the American underworld, Luciano was now positioning himself as the central figure in national organized crime. The struggle for dominance between the two men was more than just a turf war. It was a battle for supremacy. Capone's organization was known for its brutality, but Luciano's operations were far more sophisticated and well-organized. Luciano's ability to maintain his empire without resorting to the same level of violence that Capone employed gave him a significant advantage in terms of maintaining control and managing alliances. Despite the relative peace that Luciano had achieved within his own organization, the presence of rival factions continually threatened his power. In the years following the Castellamarese War, Luciano's allies had remained loyal, but the ever-present lure of power and wealth had begun to erode some of these alliances. Even his closest lieutenants, like Frank Costello and Meyer Lansky, had their own ambitions. While these men were integral to Luciano's success, they were also highly intelligent and strategic. They understood the intricacies of the business and saw the potential for their own rise to power. As Luciano became more embroiled in the operations of his empire, he had less time to manage the growing discontent that simmered beneath the surface. The more power one accumulated, the more enemies one made, and even Luciano's trusted allies were not immune to the temptation of betrayal. At the same time, Luciano had to navigate the growing tensions within the Mafia itself. While the structure he had created was unprecedented in terms of its organization, the underworld was still a volatile place. The commission which Luciano had established to ensure a balance of power among the various families was increasingly seen as both a tool of cooperation and a source of tension. As the commission became more entrenched in Mafia operations, it also became a source of infighting and competition. Each family sought to carve out its own piece of the pie, and the desire for power, especially among the younger generation of mobsters, created a breeding ground for rivalry and resentment. The Mafia, though organized, was not immune to the same petty feuds and power struggles that had plagued it before Luciano's rise. The very structure he had designed to bring stability to the organization was now threatening to unravel it from within. The ultimate manifestation of these tensions would come when Luciano found himself at odds with one of his most trusted allies, Frank Costello. Costello, who had helped Luciano in his rise to power, had become increasingly ambitious. He was well aware of the power and influence that Luciano wielded, and like many in the Mafia, Costello sought to increase his own standing within the organization. Tensions between the two men began to grow as Costello's ambitions began to conflict with Luciano's vision for the future. While Luciano had always been pragmatic, Costello was more interested in consolidating his own power and influence, often at the expense of Luciano's interests. The rift between the two men was exacerbated by outside pressures. As law enforcement's crackdown on organized crime intensified, Luciano's need for allies became even more crucial. Costello, who had long been seen as a political strategist, was integral to Luciano's dealings with politicians and government officials. But as the pressure mounted, Costello's ambitions began to create instability within the organization. The tension between the two men eventually came to a head, and Luciano's ability to maintain control was tested in ways it had never been before. The question of loyalty, something that had always been central to Luciano's success, was now at the forefront of the conflict. Would Costello remain loyal to Luciano, or would his ambition lead to betrayal? Meanwhile, Luciano also faced pressure from his competitors in the criminal underworld. While the Mafia had grown stronger under his leadership, rival gangs including the Chicago outfit and other smaller factions, were increasingly challenging his control. The competition for territory, resources, and influence was intensifying. Even as Luciano expanded his empire and solidified his position, he understood that there was always the potential for rivals to undermine his efforts. The world of organized crime was unforgiving, and there was always the looming threat of betrayal. The hidden war within Luciano's empire, driven by personal ambitions, rivalries, and the constant pressure from law enforcement, was a battle that would shape the future of organized crime. In this environment of constant tension, Luciano had to walk a tightrope, balancing loyalty and power, while maintaining the illusion of unity within his empire. His ability to manage this complex web of relationships, all while navigating the ever-changing landscape of the underworld, was a testament to his skills as a leader. But as time wore on, the forces working against him, both internal and external, would begin to chip away at the foundations of his empire. The war for control of the Mafia was far from over, and Luciano's true test of power was yet to come. The fall of Luciano's empire did not come as a sudden event, nor was it the result of a single catastrophic failure. Rather, it was the culmination of years of strategic miscalculations, shifting allegiances, and mounting external pressures. As with any empire, the more power Luciano amassed, the more vulnerable he became. The nature of his rule, based on alliances, loyalty, and fear, was always fragile. Though he had once built a sprawling and near unassailable criminal empire, the forces against him were slowly gathering, both within his organization and beyond its walls. Luciano had survived countless attempts to undermine his authority, but in the end, it would be a combination of betrayal, ambition, and the relentless pursuit of justice that would ultimately bring his reign to an end. One of the most significant factors contributing to Luciano's downfall was his decision to expand his empire into areas that were increasingly difficult to control. As his influence spread from New York to other parts of the country, Luciano had to deal with a growing number of rival criminal organizations and even new, more ambitious players within the Mafia itself. The structure that had worked so effectively for years was beginning to crack. Even as Luciano maintained a firm hold over the commission and the many Mafia families under his influence, there were always those who were plotting behind the scenes, waiting for the right moment to strike. Loyalty, so carefully nurtured in the early years of Luciano's rule, was no longer as solid as it once had been. As Luciano's empire continued to grow, so too did the expectations of those around him. His lieutenants, including Frank Costello and Meyer Lansky, had always been loyal, but loyalty in the Mafia is rarely absolute. The more successful Luciano became, the more opportunities there were for his subordinates to challenge his authority. Costello, in particular, had grown disillusioned with Luciano's leadership. Though Costello had been a close ally during the early years of Luciano's reign, the cracks in their relationship had begun to show. Costello, like many in the Mafia, was a man driven by ambition. While he was deeply loyal to Luciano, he also saw the potential for his own rise to power. The more control Luciano took over the Mafia, the more Costello began to see himself as the rightful heir to that throne. The subtle shift in their relationship was a clear sign that the balance of power was beginning to tip. The combination of Costello's growing ambitions and Luciano's increasing distance from his former allies would prove to be one of the key factors in his eventual fall from grace. Even as these internal tensions festered, the external threat to Luciano's empire was becoming more pronounced. Law enforcement, which had been relatively passive in their pursuit of organized crime during Luciano's rise, began to intensify their focus on the Mafia in the 1930s. The rise of the FBI and the aggressive tactics employed by federal agents made it increasingly difficult for Luciano to operate with the same level of impunity he had once enjoyed. The government, under the leadership of figures like Thomas E. Dewey, was beginning to close in on the Mafia. Dewey, in particular, was a formidable opponent, determined to bring down the most powerful criminal figures in the United States. His relentless pursuit of organized crime leaders, including Luciano, became one of the greatest threats to Luciano's continued dominance. Dewey's investigation into Luciano's operations, coupled with the increasing pressure from law enforcement, began to erode the foundation of Luciano's empire. The once untouchable kingpin found himself facing the reality of a system that was actively working to bring him down. Luciano's ability to operate with a degree of immunity, based on his vast network of corrupt officials and politicians, was no longer enough to protect him. The growing power of the federal government and the increasing public outcry against organized crime made it clear that Luciano's time at the top was coming to an end. It was in this environment that Luciano made the fateful decision to seek out alliances that would ultimately seal his fate. His connection with the political and law enforcement establishment, which had once served him so well, began to weaken as the government ramped up its efforts to take down the Mafia. The pressures from law enforcement, combined with the ambition of his underlings and rivals, created a perfect storm for Luciano. The cracks that had been forming in his empire began to widen, and soon they would lead to his downfall. Luciano's eventual arrest in 1936 was the result of a long and carefully orchestrated investigation led by Dewey. The federal prosecutor had been working tirelessly to build a case against Luciano, using wiretaps, surveillance, and informants to gather evidence of his criminal activities. It was a case that would hinge not only on his criminal enterprises but on his ability to influence politicians and law enforcement officials. Dewey's persistence eventually paid off when Luciano was arrested on charges of compulsory prostitution. The case was rock solid, and despite Luciano's reputation for evading the law in the past, it was clear that this time he would not escape. The trial that followed was a spectacle, a media frenzy that captivated the public and ensured Luciano's name would be synonymous with organized crime for generations. The courtroom drama that unfolded was as much about the moral judgment of the Mafia as it was about the prosecution of a single man. Luciano, despite his wealth and influence, was powerless against the tidal wave of evidence that was being presented. The trial served as a turning point in the history of the Mafia, signaling that even the most powerful figures were not invincible. Luciano's conviction in 1936 marked the end of his reign as the most powerful Mafia boss in the United States. But even as he was sentenced to 30 to 50 years in prison, Luciano remained a significant figure in the world of organized crime. He was sent to the notorious Sing Sing prison, but his influence did not dissipate. Despite being behind bars, Luciano continued to control the operations of his criminal empire with remarkable effectiveness. He used his connections and influence to maintain control over the Mafia, and his ability to manipulate events from prison demonstrated his enduring power. His role as a leader of the commission remained intact, and he continued to pull the strings of the underworld from his cell. However, even from prison, Luciano was not immune to the forces working against him. In 1946, after serving just 10 years of his sentence, Luciano was deported to Italy. His release was part of a deal that involved the U.S. government's desire to maintain influence over Mafia operations in Sicily, a place that had long been under the Mafia's control. This deal, which involved Luciano's cooperation with the U.S. military during World War II, marked the end of his reign over the American Mafia. Deportation was a bitter blow for Luciano. Though he had lost his control over the Mafia in the U.S., he remained an important figure in Italy's criminal landscape. The years following his deportation were marked by decline. Luciano, now living in exile in Italy, found himself a shadow of his former self. The power he once wielded so effectively had eroded, and the political alliances he had cultivated during his rise had faded. Though he remained a respected figure in the world of organized crime, he was no longer the kingpin he had once been. His influence was diminished, and his personal life was marked by a sense of isolation. He died in 1962 in relative obscurity, far from the empire he had once built. Luciano's fall from power was a testament to the fragile nature of even the most well-established empires. His rise had been built on the principles of loyalty, organization, and strategic alliances, but in the end, these same principles led to his undoing. The forces of ambition, betrayal, and law enforcement that had once been under his control ultimately worked against him. His downfall was not a sudden collapse, but rather a slow erosion of power that culminated in his conviction and deportation. The man who had once been the most feared figure in organized crime was now relegated to a footnote in history, a symbol of both the heights to which ambition can rise and the depths to which it can fall. Luciano's trial and subsequent conviction marked a profound turning point in both his life and in the history of organized crime. The case against him was meticulously built by prosecutor Thomas E. Dewey, who had made it his mission to dismantle the Mafia's control over New York and, by extension, the nation. Dewey's determination was matched by Luciano's own resilience, but in the courtroom, it became clear that even a man of Luciano's caliber could not escape the weight of his criminal empire's many transgressions. The trial was an extraordinary spectacle, attracting the attention of the media and the public. For the first time, a man who had been so elusive, so untouchable, was finally facing the full force of the law. Luciano, who had once run the Mafia with an almost businesslike precision, was now forced to confront the very system he had manipulated for so long. The charges were serious: compulsory prostitution, a federal offense that linked him directly to the exploitation of women through his network of brothels. Despite his best efforts to resist the charge and the high-profile nature of his defense, the evidence was insurmountable. Throughout the trial, Luciano maintained his composure, but the gravity of the situation was evident. It was the first time the public truly saw the man behind the legend, not as a ruthless mob boss but as a defendant at the mercy of the law. The prosecutors presented a well-organized case, focusing not only on his direct involvement in illegal activities but also on his ability to corrupt and manipulate those around him. The sheer scale of Luciano's operations, his grip on bootlegging, gambling, and labor racketeering, was outlined in excruciating detail. The public's perception of him, once seen as an untouchable criminal kingpin, began to shift. The trial revealed not just the darkness of his world, but the vast network of people who had been complicit in his rise to power. Luciano's defense was robust, with his lawyers arguing that the charges against him were politically motivated, a tactic often used by criminals facing overwhelming evidence. They also sought to cast doubt on the testimony of witnesses and informants, claiming that the evidence was circumstantial. But Luciano's fate was sealed. Despite his considerable wealth, political connections, and the network of people who owed him favors, the system he had long manipulated had caught up with him. In 1936, he was convicted and sentenced to 30 to 50 years in prison. Luciano's sentencing was a moment of bittersweet irony. He had spent years building an empire on the very foundation of corruption and manipulation, and yet he found himself at the mercy of a system he had spent much of his life undermining. The trial was not just a personal loss for Luciano, it symbolized a larger victory for law enforcement in their ongoing battle against organized crime. His conviction represented a shift in the balance of power, as the government had successfully dismantled one of the most powerful criminal organizations in the country. For many, it was a moment of vindication, proof that even the most powerful criminals were not invincible. But even behind bars, Luciano's influence did not wane. In prison, he continued to maintain control over his operations, using his extensive network of contacts to direct his criminal empire. The Mafia's business dealings continued as Luciano's subordinates worked to keep the flow of money moving, and his ability to manage the organization from within the walls of Sing Sing prison was a testament to his strategic genius. Though he was no longer the undisputed boss of the Mafia, his presence was still felt in every corner of the criminal world. His ability to coordinate activities, manage relationships, and keep rivals in check made him a force to be reckoned with, even from his prison cell. Yet, Luciano's time in prison was not without its struggles. The legal system that had once been his ally was now a constant source of frustration. He faced multiple attempts at parole, but each was denied. In the meantime, he continued to hold sway over the underworld, but the government was not done with him. As the years passed, Luciano's influence began to wane. His attempts to reassert himself in the criminal world were complicated by the growing power of other mobsters and the relentless pursuit of law enforcement. In 1946, after serving only 10 years of his sentence, Luciano was granted parole, a decision that raised many eyebrows. The terms of his release were part of a deal struck between the U.S. government and Luciano, who agreed to cooperate with American authorities in exchange for his freedom. The deal was likely influenced by the political climate of the time, particularly the government's interest in maintaining control over mafia operations in Italy, where Luciano's influence remained significant. The U.S. government had long been interested in ensuring that the Mafia did not gain a foothold in Europe, and Luciano's release was seen as a means to achieve that goal. The deal involved his deportation to Italy, a country where he still had ties and where his criminal activities could continue to benefit U.S. interests.